All right. So this video, we're going to talk about DWI, driving while intoxicated. And so the central aspect of any impaired driving case is impairment, right? That there is a presumption that the person, you know, is under the influence of a substance. It can be alcohol, it can be drugs, or some combination thereof. Now, when you get into drugs, especially when it's the combination thereof of alcohol and drugs, it can get the waters can get kind of muddy. But from a patrol perspective, what we really need to be concerned about is identifying and describing impairment, impaired driving. So there's basically kind of three different elements to a DWI, building a good DWI case. One is going to be what clues, if any, did the driver demonstrate that would, while they were driving the vehicle, what behaviors would be indicative of potential impairment. Now, granted, any any offense that could point to impairment could also be not impairment. So, for example, lane violation, right? You see them drive over the center, across the center line of the highway for a few seconds, and then they meander back, and maybe they do that more than once, right? Though that would be an offense that I would say is indicative of impairment, right? But it can also have an innocent explanation that maybe they were just simply distracted. Maybe they're having some kind of car maintenance issues, where the steering is pulling one way or the other or whatever, and they just um, had let go of the steering wheel a little too much and it meandered itself. I'm not saying that's what it is, but um, each one of these things contributes, is what I'm saying. By itself, a lane violation is not proof of a DWI. It's just one of what we hope is going to be several things that stack one on top of the other to get us over the hump of a probable cause for impairment. So you have something like a lane violation is probably one of the more common ones. It could be that they forgot to turn their headlights on at night when they're driving, because obviously impairment can cause you to make those kind of mistakes. Whereas when you're sober, you're less likely to make those mistakes. Um, driving too slow, uh, while it can have an innocent explanation, maybe you're having car trouble or whatever, it also could be that that you're just so drunk or so high that you don't know what's going on. And even speeding, not because people don't speed when they're sober, certainly they do, but it can indicate, you know, alcohol and drug intoxication can lower your inhibitions and cause you to do things, more likely to do things that are reckless or dangerous or whatever like that. So what did you stop the vehicle for, right? And is that potentially indicative of impairment? It could be that you stopped them because they had um, expired tags, and it had nothing to do with, and that is not indicative of impairment, right? That doesn't mean you can't still build a case. It just means that you're not, nothing in that vehicle in motion stage is contributing to an impairment case, right? If you stop them for another reason, that's fine, you know, but you're going to be relying on the next phase, which is contact with the driver. When you contact the driver and you go through the usual motions of a traffic stop, right? You say, "Hey, I'm Deputy so and such with the sheriff's office, and the reason I stopped you is insert reason here. Then can I see your driver's license, proof of insurance, whatever else that you want. And they will then interact with you, right? You're looking for things, signs that point to impairment, right? While you're collecting their driver's license or whatever. It's like, are they having trouble finding it? Um, do they search through their car for a few seconds and then look back at you like, what am I supposed to be doing? Like they forgot what you told them to do. Those could be signs of impairment. Slurred speech, glassy eyes, odors. You smell the odor of it. We describe it as an odor of intoxicants, but the odor that you associate with an alcoholic beverage, or burnt marijuana, or you know whatever else there is. There's several things that can give you better clues probably than their driving behavior. And again, these things stack on top of one another. Is there a reason that a sober person might smell like they've been drinking when they haven't? Possibly. Maybe it's the passenger in the car rather than the driver that you're smelling, and it's just so overwhelming that it's engulfed the whole car. That's one of the reasons why it's pretty common for them to ask drivers to step out, and maybe come back to the patrol car, because if you separate the driver from the vehicle and then you can still smell it when they're talking to you, it's better indication that yes, that odor is coming from them and not maybe a passenger in the vehicle, or maybe that somebody threw up in the vehicle, or maybe they just spilled an alcoholic beverage in the vehicle, and unless it was on the driver, it wouldn't be like that. So when you contact the driver and you smell the odor, you ask them to step out, and then they start stumbling whenever they're walking back, or to the back of the car. You might ask them if they've had anything to drink, and they tell you that they've had a couple of beers. That's probably one of the most common things, uh, and which leads to the follow-up question of just how big were those beers? Couple of what, pitchers? So you you get the point. You ask them to step back, you know, you get more signs of impairment, and at a certain point, that starts to build and stack to where the potential innocent explanations for each one of those things, uh, well, it carries less weight. Their claims that they didn't have very much to drink, their um, claim that maybe somebody spilled beer on them, their you know the fact that they could commit a lane violation for other reasons, like they were distracted or tired or what have you. That starts to fade away the more of these clues that you get stacked on top of one another. Now, we cannot compel somebody to provide a breath and or blood sample unless we get to the probable cause standard, meaning that unless we have probable cause to arrest them for DWI, we cannot make them, say you have to provide a sample. Now, there is something called implied consent, and that means that in every state in the union, when you get a driver's license, you sign an agreement that states that if a law enforcement officer requests you to provide a breath sample or a blood sample, that if you will agree to do so. And the enforcement of that is that if you refuse to provide a sample voluntarily, then the Department of Revenue will suspend your license for a year. You'll have a 1 year revocation on your driver's license. And if you challenge that and say, hey, this isn't right or whatever, the only thing that the state has to prove to have that revocation held up is that you were asked to submit to a test and you refused. So, um, uh, otherwise, what has to happen is that we have to get an actual search warrant, just like for any other to collect any other evidence, right? We get a search warrant for a blood sample is what we usually ask for if we're doing it with a warrant. And um, there are mechanisms in place in most counties now to be able to get that warrant in a timely fashion, because that is one of the problems with particularly alcohol related intoxication is that it is only for a period of time. That evidence is um, fragile. It will, you know, you have to collect it in a timely fashion. And so even with our kind of expedited system, it can take an hour or two to get a search warrant, for a blood draw. And in some cases that might be too much time. If somebody's already stopped drinking and their trajectory on their blood alcohol is coming down, by the time you get the warrant, it could be too late. But sorry, that's a little off in the weeds for what we're talking about here. The point that I'm getting at is that we have to be able to build an impairment case without knowing what their BAC is, without knowing what particular drugs that they're under the influence of. And that can be really tricky, particularly um, particularly if you have a driver that is not cooperative. In other words, they're unwilling to do the field sobriety tests. Um, because at that point you're really relying on whether or not you observe more obvious signs of intoxication, which you're going to be less likely to see if they are close to the legal limit, 0.08, 0.09, that kind of thing. When they start getting up over 0.10, it becomes obvious enough that even without fields, you can usually, have enough without their cooperation. You can have enough to prove it because they're going to tend to be more slurring in their speech. They're going to tend to be more unsteady on their feet. You know, they're going to give themselves away, um, even without the field sobriety tests. And then there's times that they're so drunk that they really cannot complete the tests. So I want to talk a little bit. There's separate videos about field sobriety tests, so I'm not going to go over the particulars of them in the sense of you know in depth. But I did want to talk a little bit about how they came to be, and that is the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration uh, has come up with this battery of tests. There's three that are promoted, and then there's a handful of others that are optional in the case where one or more of the three preferred ones cannot be done. Like, if you pull somebody over in the middle of winter and it's ice and snow all over the ground, you're not going to want them to do the walk and turn, on the side of the road, and so you may ask them to do other tests, instead of that one. But the three that are the preferred ones are the walk and turn test, the one leg stand test, and then what they call horizontal gaze nystagmus, which is that when you're intoxicated, particularly by alcohol, it will cause your eyes to have this kind of involuntary jerking of the pupils when you're moving them back and forth. And depending on what degree of intoxicated that you are, you'll see that more or less. The first visibility of it is when your eyes are kind of 90 degrees one way or the other, or 45 degrees one way or another. And then as you get more and more progressively intoxicated, it gets to a point where you're going to see that jerking much, pretty much all the time. And there are other things that can cause nystagmus, which is why you ask them if they have any injuries or anything like that. If they have resting nystagmus or whatever, head injuries and stuff like that can cause it too. But it's a very good. for somebody that doesn't have like medical issues that would give them nystagmus, resting nystagmus. It's a very good indicator of impairment. And so you've got, things that you can do roadside. And you may be asking yourself, why, oh, why would anybody cooperate with that if they know that they're intoxicated? And it's because one of the effects that impairment has on you, whether it's drugs or alcohol, but particularly alcohol, is that it makes you a little bit cocky, you know? And so how we tend to present it whenever we have somebody roadside is, and I mean it's not like it's a lie, it is true, is that, hey, can you do some tests for me? Because I need to verify that you're okay to drive. And the reason I say it's not a lie is because if we're wrong and they're not impaired, then we can rule that out real quick with this battery test, and say, oh, well, okay, you're free to go. So, I mean, if you do pass the tests, you know, you are basically demonstrating that you're okay to drive. So, um, so if you have a case maybe where it's kind of borderline, right? Where, you know, if I did have the legal authority to get a quick breath sample or whatever, it would be like zero point zero 0.06 or zero point zero 0.05 or zero point zero 0.04 or something, uh, something where there is some alcohol in your system, but not enough to be presumably over the legal limit. Um, you might give off enough indicators where I say, hey, I need, you know, I need to check and make sure you're okay to drive. So the reason that I say that about the cockiness or whatever is because if you've been out for a night of drinking, right, and you're driving and you get pulled over and you realize, shoot, I've had like half a dozen beers, dang it, you're going to have an indication that you're probably not okay to drive, right? And so when the cop suggests and says, hey, I need to check and see if you're okay to drive, if you know that you're probably not okay to drive, why would you do this? And it's because, like I said, when you're drunk, you think, I can pass it, like I don't know. There's this kind of uh, hubris that kind of comes along with uh, intoxication and a reckless spirit, where you're actually not making good decisions, you know, probably why you got behind the wheel in the first place. And so um, it's it's actually pretty uncommon for people to refuse the SFSTs, and we call them that standardized field sobriety test is what it stands for. But it's pretty uncommon for people to refuse it, but when they do, it does throw a wrench in the works to a degree. If you're in a borderline kind of a case where you have maybe a couple of clues, but you're not necessarily sure if it meets the probable cause threshold. It can be tricky because you cannot compel them. You can only make polite requests. One of the things that we carry with us sometimes is something called a PBT, or a portable breath test. It's basically like a compact and portable version of a breathalyzer, but because it's compact and portable, it's you know it's not. It can only be used in the sense of establishing probable cause. You know, it's not like if I do a PBT and it's, let's say that it says a zero point 0.2, or a 0.15 or whatever. Um, the only thing I can indicate in my report is that the PBT indicated that alcohol was present in their system. You know, um, I can't really I can't really testify to the accuracy of that. Um, and then that can get me to where, okay, I'm going to place you under arrest for DWI. Now we can go, and I either need to get you, you to voluntarily you provide a breath sample for the breath machine, or get a warrant for a blood draw. Because the PBT by itself is not going to be court admissible to prove whether you were over or under the legal limit. It only indicates that it detected the presence of alcohol. Um, so in those kind of borderline cases, that can put it over the edge one way or another. So, you know, um, we will, assuming we have one available to us, if they refuse the field sobriety test, we'll usually ask them if they're willing to do that, and sometimes they are. Despite the fact that they'll be willing to do, they won't be willing to do field sobriety, but they'll be willing to do that, and then you do it, and it's like, oh wow, that's high, you know, like why did you agree to do that? Um, and understand too that different different people will exhibit more or less signs of impairment with the same amount of alcohol in their system. There are lots of factors that go along with that, whether or not they are a regular drinker. Somebody who's like a chronic alcoholic or whatever, they will have very high blood alcohol content, and they will sometimes be difficult to detect, as far as signs of impairment. Sometimes the only thing you're going to get is some slight slurring of the speech, but they'll be walking and around just fine, meanwhile, somebody else, and they just have like a 0.12 or something like that, and they're stumbling all over the place, so whether they have built up a tolerance, whether they have, uh, gone without drinking for a period of time and this is them falling off the wagon, they're going to have a more acute reaction to it. How much they've eaten, um, all of that kind of their body weight, body size, body mass will play a role as well. So a more petite individual, a lighter weight individual is uh, going to be more intoxicated with less alcohol. So that being said, um, it's all about documenting your observations. You cannot summarize it. You cannot be, um, because it matters. Because you basically have to establish probable cause to believe that they are intoxicated or under the influence of drugs, and that has caused impairment in their driving before you can take them in for the breath sample or so um, you basically have to establish all of that roadside, because you cannot you cannot force them basically to come to the station to prove that they're not drunk unless you have PC, probable cause to arrest them for drunk driving. And so it can be kind of a sticky situation. And I've had a handful of kind of borderline kind of situations where I had to make that judgment call, as to, do I have probable cause? Do I not have probable cause with somebody that's less than cooperative? Um, and it really comes down to, at the end of the day, you're the one that's going to have to defend it in court. And so if it's like, oh, I think I think there's alcohol on board, but I can't I can't necessarily say that it's significant enough for me to arrest them without having more information, then you know then you got to let them go. So DWIs are one of the more commonly litigated offenses. Like that, people will tend to fight that more vigorously than other charges. There's several reasons for that, but the most significant one is what I just told you, and that is that if they can attack and say that at the time on the side of the road you failed to establish probable cause, they can throw out blood test results. They can everything that follows from that is considered fruit of the poisonous tree. If they can say you didn't have a valid reason to stop them in the first place, that can throw everything out, everything that follows, because you have to be able to show, based on your observations, based on their behavior roadside, you have to be able to establish that they are drunk beyond a reasonable doubt. Uh, you don't have to be able to say what their BAC is or anything like that, but you have to be able to establish that there was probable cause to believe that they may be drunk. Now, in court, what's going to be important is establishing what was impairing them and how much and all this stuff. With that, you can get from the breath test results, the blood test results, and stuff like that. But we do not yet have a portable enough machine to take it out roadside and have it be court admissible. PBTs only can be used in the context of saying, yes, I had probable cause to arrest them, you know, and then I got a more reliable blood test result or breath test result, you know. Um, so that being said, um, DWI cases are nuanced, they're tricky, they require specialized training, in particular when we're talking about the combination ones, and the drug intoxication, because drug intoxication, different types of narcotics will have different effects in the body. And so you really, there is a program that is known as drug recognition expert, where you attend a very significant amount of training and followed by a basically a almost kind of like an apprenticeship type program where you're working under the tutelage of an established DRE, and you basically build your credibility and your knowledge about drug related intoxication to a level that you can qualify to testify in court as an expert witness on the topic. It's basically like a degree program for this particular discipline. They are few, and it's a difficult process to get it. But um, especially since like Missouri has legalized marijuana, and more states are following suit with that, um, it is something that is going to have to become more common if we're going to uh, be able to enforce impaired driving against folks that aren't just alcohol intoxicated. So that being said, that's all I have for you today. But I just wanted to kind of go in depth on that. I couldn't find a good kind of pre-produced video that would uh, cover this, so I had to kind of make my own. And so here we go.